pair of mules dragged a battered freight wagon down the frozen main street of Harrow's Bend, and chained to its bed sat a pine crate bound at every corner in dark iron. Across the lid, in ink faded to the color of weak tea, a long-dead outlaw's name had been burned into the wood, and beneath it, in a steadier hand, waited a second name. A 19-year-old woman in a hay-colored headscarf stopped in the middle of the street, a sack of cornmeal slipping from her hip. The clerk turned the manifest toward her and pressed his pen into her cold fingers, tapping the line where her own family name was written. Behind her, a knot of townspeople drew closer, some laughing low, one woman quietly crossing herself. She looked at the crate addressed to a man, 40 years in his grave, then down at the 6 Wharton coins that were the last money she owned. The wind pulled at her loose braid as she leaned to sign her name beneath the outlaws. And somewhere inside that sealed box, packed in old straw by a hand she almost recognized, lay the answer that would unmake every story this valley had ever told. What would you do if a wooden crate came rolling into your town on a wagon, addressed in faded ink to a man who had been dead for 40 years, and the clerk pressed the pen into your hand and asked you to sign for it? What would you do if the name burned into that pine lid was the one name every gray-headed rancher in the valley still lowered his voice to speak? The name mothers once used to hush their children indoors when the light went long across the ridge. In the town of Harrow's Bend, in the dry autumn of 1884, a 19-year-old woman named Della Ashcroft set her signature beneath an outlaw's, paid 6 bits she could not spare, and hauled that crate home by lantern light down a frozen road. What waited under the iron bands would unmake the memory of every family strung along the valley floor. Stay with it. Settle in. This one is worth the long walk. Della Ashcroft came back to Harrow's Bend on a Tuesday in the last blue hour before dark, her father 3 weeks under the churchyard sod, her pockets lighter than the dust on her boots. She rode in the bed of a freighter's wagon, because the stage cost more than she owned. Her carpet bag wedged between her knees, her brown hair coming loose from its braid, beneath a headscarf, the color of cured hay. The road bent past the little burying ground where her grandmother lay under a leaning marker, past a sagging rail fence her father had always meant to set right, past the livery where a boy she'd known in another life now shod horses for wages that never quite became a living. Nobody lifted a hand to her. Word had gone ahead the way word always ran in a place where news outpaced weather. The Ashcroft girl was home. The Ashcroft girl had nothing but the clothes on her back. She climbed down at the depot and counted coins into the freighter's palm that she would miss before the week was out. The plank walk groaned beneath her heels. The air carried wood smoke and horse, and the faint copper tang the creek gave off when the water ran low and the stones lay bare. Above the mercantile, a lantern already burned, though the sun still bled orange along the western rim of the world. She stood a moment with her bag at her feet and looked at the town she had left at 15, the town she had promised herself she would only enter again once she had made something worth showing. She had come back with less than she carried out. She had come back because the road had run out of other places to take her. The house at the end of Wren Lane was hers now, and the mortgage note tacked to its door was hers, and a small stubborn ember of hope she carried behind her ribs was hers, and she meant to hold every one of them. That first night she slept in her father's chair beside a cold stove and dreamed of nothing at all, and she woke to the groan of a wagon axle laboring down the hard-packed road. Her mother she did not dream of, because her mother had been gone since Della was 6 years old, taken by a winter fever before the girl was old enough to hold the memory of her face. It had been the two of them after that, father and daughter, a man and a small solemn child, learning the shape of each other across a plank table, and now it was only her. She had carried that arithmetic all the way south and back, and it had not gotten easier for the counting. The freight came in on a Wednesday, hauled by a pair of mules and driven by a man Della had never laid eyes on, a stranger with a beard the color of iron filings, and a hat pulled low against the flat autumn glare. He drew up outside the depot and called for the clerk, and the clerk came out drying his hands on his apron and squinted at the manifest. then squinted harder, the way a man does when the paper in front of him refuses to make ordinary sense. Della was crossing the rutted street with a sack of cornmeal balanced on her hip when she heard her family name spoken aloud, and she stopped, because it had been her father's name too, and she was not yet accustomed to hearing it float loose in the air, without him standing under it. The clerk waved her over with the manifest. He tapped the page with one knuckle. Ashcroft property, he told her, and she was the nearest kin the paper could find. She set the cornmeal sack down on the planks and looked at the thing riding the wagon bed. It was a pine box the size of a small steamer trunk, bound at every corner with iron bands gone dark from the grease of long roads, and across the top, in a hand faded to the color of weak tea, ran a name she had heard only in stories told after the lamps were trimmed low. Silas Thorne, the outlaw, the man who had ridden out of Harrow's Bend in the year 1844 with a posse strung out behind him and had never once come back. Whose grave, if the earth had ever claimed him, lay somewhere out in the broken country to the east, where the Badlands chewed the horizon to teeth. 40 years gone, if gone he was, and the crate bore his name, and beneath it, in a smaller and clearer hand that had faded less than the name above it, someone had written Ashcroft in letters she very nearly recognized. He'd been dead 40 years, she told the clerk, her voice coming out smaller than she meant it to. The clerk only shrugged and turned the manifest so she could read it herself. Paper said deliver. Paper said nearest kin. She told him she was no kin to any outlaw. The paper said Ashcroft, he answered, and she was the only Ashcroft the county had left. Behind her, a small crowd had begun to knot together the way crowds gather in a town where little happens and everything is remembered. She felt their eyes settle on the back of her neck like flies on a windowsill. Somebody laughed, short and mean, the sound of a man enjoying another person's misfortune. Somebody else murmured what might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. A boy pointed. A woman drew the sign of the cross over her own breastbone. The freighter waited with his lines slack in his fists and his face folded like old harness leather, and he said nothing because none of it was his to say. Della looked at the crate, and the crate held its silence, iron-bound and impossible, and addressed to a ghost, and she thought of her father cold in the ground, and of the note nailed to the door on Wren Lane, and of the 6 bits in her apron pocket that were the last hard coins standing between her and true want. Then the freighter cleared his throat and told her the one thing that would not let her be. That box had been sitting in a bonded warehouse, he said, longer than he'd been driving the route. Storage paid up in advance, years of it, by somebody who'd left standing orders that it not move an inch until an Ashcroft came back to Harrow's Bend to claim it. He'd carried strange freight in his time, but never a parcel that seemed to have been lying in wait for a person to be born and grow and come home. She signed. She could not have said, in that moment, exactly why. She wrote her name below the outlaws in the clerk's smudged ledger, and she paid the freight, and she borrowed a handcart from the depot boy against the promise of a mended shirt, and she loaded the crate onto it and pushed it home herself, down the frozen ruts of Wren Lane by the light of a single kerosene lantern hung swinging from the handle. The town watched her go. Somebody laughed again, louder now, feeling safe in it. Somebody said, loud enough to carry across the cold air, that the Ashcroft girl had come all the way home just to inherit a dead man's trouble. And that was about the whole of what an Ashcroft could ever expect to draw. Della did not turn her head. Her breath made small ghosts that the lantern caught and let go. The crate rattled over the ruts. The wheels complained. The dark pressed in from the fields on either side. What could drive a girl with nothing left to lose to set her name beneath an outlaw's? What could possibly be waiting inside a box addressed to a man 4 decades in his grave? And why, out of all the Ashcrofts who had ever drawn breath and been buried in Harrow's Bend, was it her name that some patient hand had written under his? She would not sleep easy again until she knew. By the next morning, the story had traveled the length of the town twice over and come back to her changed in the telling. That was the way of the place. A thing spoken at the depot at dusk was a thing repeated in the mercantile by breakfast. And a thing repeated in the mercantile by breakfast was a thing muttered over the church pews come Sunday, whether Sunday had arrived yet or not. Della woke in her father's chair with the lantern guttered to a black wick, and the crate squatting in the middle of the front room, like a stone that had fallen through the roof in the night. She had not opened it. She had meant to. She had sat before it with the pry bar across her knees and the iron bands catching the last of the light. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the whole weight of the day had folded her down into sleep. Now the stove sat cold, and the window showed gray, and the crate was still there, still real, still marked with a dead man's name and hers below it in that hand she almost placed. She went out for water because the bucket had run dry, and because she could not yet bear to sit alone in a room with the thing another hour. The pump at the corner of Wren Lane shrieked under her arm. Across the way, a woman twitched a curtain aside and let it fall. Two men down the street stopped their talking as she passed and took it up again behind her in a lower key, and the name Thorne rode the cold air toward her like a thread of smoke off a banked fire. Della kept her eyes on the tin bucket and her braid tucked up under the hay-colored scarf and did not slow her step for any of them. At the mercantile, she traded a mended button off her coat for a twist of salt. And Hetty, the woman behind the counter, who had known her since she was small enough to perch on the flour barrels, would not quite bring her eyes up to Della's. "Best mind yourself, girl," Hetty told her, low, and did not say against what. Outside, a knot of boys hooted from beyond the water trough. One of them, no older than 10, hollered across the road that the Ashcroft girl had a dead man boxed up in her parlor, and another laughed until he choked, and a third crossed himself the way his mother had taught him and did not laugh at all, and Della felt something in her chest go quietly to iron. She was halfway back down Wren Lane with the full bucket dragging at her hip when the shadow of a horse fell across the ruts ahead of her, and she raised her head into the face of the one man in Harrow's Bend she had most hoped to avoid. He sat his saddle, easy, the way a man sits who has never once wondered where his next meal was riding in from. He wore a good wool coat and a hat that had never been caught out in a hard rain. His name was Amos Kettering, and he held the note on the house at the end of Wren Lane, and he had held it since before her father took to his bed. "Miss Ashcroft," he greeted her, and smiled the smile a man gives a child who has picked up something far too heavy for her arms. He'd heard, he said, that she had come into an inheritance. She said nothing. "A whole crate of it," Kettering went on, addressed to a road agent 40 years cold in the dirt. "Well, now, that was the Ashcroft luck laid bare, wasn't it? Her daddy chased a dry claim 10 years running and put nothing in the ground but sweat, and now his girl had gone and signed her own name under a horse thief's." He leaned down over the pommel, and his voice dropped soft, which was worse than any shout. "The note came due. In 30 days, he reminded her. He did not imagine an outlaw had thought to leave her any coin. When the time came, she should come and see him, and the two of them would have a reasonable talk about what a girl alone in the world could rightly afford to keep. Then he did a curious thing. He straightened in the saddle and let his gaze drift up the valley, toward the high ground where the creek came down out of the hills, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite greed and not quite memory, but partook of both. "Odd," he said, half to himself, "that the name Thorne should surface again now, after all these years, and in her hands of all the hands in the county. There was land at the head of that valley," he said, "that had gone begging for an honest owner since before she was born. A careful person might do well to let old boxes stay shut and old names stay buried." He touched his hat to her, and he rode on, and Della stood in the ruts with the bucket handle cutting a red line across her palm, and did not move until the sound of his horse had thinned away to nothing. She turned that last remark over as she walked. He had not needed to mention the land. He had come to speak of the note, and the note alone would have served his purpose. And yet the name of a dead outlaw had pulled something up out of him that he had not quite managed to keep down. Whatever lay at the head of the valley, Amos Kettering wanted it, and the wanting was old, and the arrival of that crate had frightened him enough to ride down a cold lane and warn a penniless girl away from a box she had not yet even opened. She was nearly to her own door when the last voice of the morning found her. An old man sat on the bench outside the smithy, with both hands folded over the head of a hickory cane, his eyes the pale washed blue of a sky, rubbed thin by too much sun. She had known his face all her life, without ever once trading words with him. Elias Ward, the town called him, and he had been old when her father was a barefoot boy. He watched her come, and he watched her pass, and when she was very nearly by him, he spoke a single time without turning his head. What was buried, he told the empty road, was never the same as what was lost. Della stopped. She turned and looked at him, but his mouth had already closed and set, and his eyes had gone out past the road to some country she could not follow him into. She waited, and he offered her nothing more, and after a long moment she went on down Wren Lane, with the old man's words settling into her the way cold water settles into a deep well, slow and final, and impossible to draw back out. She carried them into the house. She set the bucket beside the stove. She looked at the crate standing iron-bound in the middle of the floor, and Ward's line lay behind her eyes and would not be moved. And she found that she did not open the box that day either. She could not have said what stayed her hand, except that the old man's words had come down on her chest, like a palm laid flat, and asked her, plainly, to wait. And she had learned young to trust the weight of an old man's hand over the shine of a young man's smile. So she built the fire back up from the last of the split pine. She boiled thin coffee in her mother's dented pot. She ate a heel of cornbread standing at the window, because her father's chair still held the shape of him, and she was not ready to sit down inside that hollow. She watched the light go blue over the ridge, and then go out entirely, and the house grew cold. In a way she had half forgotten houses could be cold. The wind coming in under the door in a thin, steady thread that stirred the hem of her skirt as it passed. Somewhere out in the dark, a loose shutter knocked once against its frame, and then held still. The crate sat where she had left it, and she noticed she had turned her father's chair around to face it, the way a body faces a stranger seated across a table, waiting to learn which of them will be the first to speak. She lit the lantern and set it on the pine lid. The light drew itself up over the two names, one written above the other. Silas Thorne in ink gone the color of weak tea, and Ashcroft below it in that steadier hand she had spent the long hours since Wednesday coming to believe she knew. It was not her father's writing. It was older than her father's writing. It carried the same forward lean in the tall letters, the same short decisive stroke across the crossbars, but it had learned itself in a schoolroom back east, a whole generation before her father was ever born. She slept in the chair a second night, though she had not meant to. She had meant to keep some kind of watch over what she could not have told you. Twice she surfaced from sleep, and each time the crate stood where it had been, and the lantern burned low and steady, and the wind moved through the eaves like some slow animal turning over in its den. Once, near the deepest trench of the night, she thought she heard something inside the crate settle, the small dry shift of weight against wood, the way an old hound resettles its bones nearer the fire. She held her breath until her chest ached with holding it. The sound did not come a second time. She told herself it was only the cold working at the boards. She told herself it was only the house, talking to itself the way old houses do. By dawn, she had made a decision without fully feeling herself make it. She would live alongside the thing one more day. She would boil coffee on the stove, where her mother had once boiled coffee, and she would lay her flat hand on the pine lid, the way you lay a hand on a horse's warm flank before you swing up, so the animal knows a rider is coming and does not startle. And then, when the light stood right, she would open it. The light, she felt sure, would tell her when the time had come. Morning came slow into the front room, the color of skimmed milk against the east window. And Della stood at the stove with her palms spread over the first thin heat and watched the crate the way you watch a stranger, asleep, in a chair across the room. She had brewed the coffee weaker than yesterday's. There was little enough left in the tin, and less coming. She carried a cup to her father's chair and sat with it, balanced on her knee, and studied the two names in the plain gray light. In daylight, the ink of Silas Thorne had faded nearly to the tone of the wood itself, as though the name were trying to sink back down into the grain and be forgotten. The name Ashcroft stood clearer against the pale pine, younger somehow, though the crate that carried both had plainly ridden the same 40 years of road. She leaned in close. She had spent 2 nights certain she knew the hand, and now, in the flat, honest light of morning, she was certain of it in a way that made her set the cup down on the floorboards with a small ringing knock. The tall letters carried the same forward pitch as the writing in the family Bible on the shelf above the stove. The Bible her grandmother had kept. The Bible in which her grandmother had set down every birth and every death in a script she had learned in a schoolroom, back east before the war had come and rearranged the whole shape of the country. Della stood up. She crossed the room. She took the Bible down and opened it flat on the plank table and turned it toward the window and looked at the writing on the first blank leaf, where her grandmother had entered the Ashcroft names in careful ink across the years. Then she looked back at the crate. The Ashcroft on the pine lid and the Ashcroft in the Bible had come off the same nib, guided by the same patient hand. Her grandmother had lain in the churchyard 11 years. Whatever this crate was, her grandmother had readied it long before she died, addressed it in her own careful hand, and left standing orders and prepaid freight so that it would sit in a warehouse and wait. Patient as she had been patient, for the one grandchild she must have known would someday have nowhere left to go but home. Della stood at the table a long while. She did not weep. She laid the flat of her hand on the open Bible, then walked back and laid the same hand on the pine lid and felt the cold of the wood come up through her palm and into the bones of her wrist. Something shifted then, under the lid or inside her own chest. She could not have separated the two. Still, she did not open the crate. She had promised herself she would wait for the light, and the light was not yet the light she wanted. And the decision she had made without making it now felt like a rope she had to keep both hands on, or lose her footing entirely. She went out instead to fetch wood. The pile behind the house had dwindled to 2 armloads of split pine and a scattering of kindling. She carried what there was in against her apron and stacked it by the stove, then went back out to the woodshed to see what her father had left standing. In the shed she found a splitting maul with a head worked loose on its handle, a stack of unsplit rounds gone silver gray on the outside from a season of weather, and at the back wall, half hidden behind a stiff fold of old canvas, a length of iron banding she did not at first understand. She lifted it into the gray light from the shed door and turned it over. It was the same width as the iron on the crate. It was the same iron, the same dark grain of it. One end had been cut clean and square, the other left rough, as though someone had once taken a piece off the same batch to serve some other purpose. Here, in her father's shed, in her grandmother's shed before that, a piece of the very metal that bound the outlaw's box had been lying against the wall the whole time, waiting like everything else in this town seemed to be waiting. Della laid the banding down across the workbench and stood with her hand flat on the cold metal. Out on the ridge, a jay screamed once, and then thought better of it and went quiet. She did not know yet what the cut iron meant. She only knew that it tied her father's shed to the crate on her floor by a thread of dark metal, and that there was no unlearning a thing once it had found its way into you. She went back inside and stood them all against the wall and warmed her hands at the stove. The crate held its place. She would not open it yet. She had decided, again, without quite deciding, that she would first put her hands on the house itself, on the very boards and joints of it. Because if the house had been keeping something from her, all these years the house would surrender it, the way a horse tells its rider through the reins whether the trail ahead is sound, if only the rider sits quiet enough in the saddle to feel the message come up the leather. She began with the stove. She scraped the ash out into a tin pail. She wiped the flat top with a damp rag and watched the water hiss and curl into steam. She swept the front room with a broom whose straw had worn down crooked on one side, sweeping careful circles around the crate without once letting the bristles touch it. She washed the 2 front windows with vinegar water and a strip of muslin, and the light that came through afterward stood cleaner and colder and showed her the room as she had not truly seen it since she was 15 years old. It showed her the smoke stain feathered above the stove. It showed her the door frame where her father had scratched her height with a nail at 6, and again at 10, and again at 12, and then never again. The marks climbing, and then stopping like a staircase that ran out of house. It showed her the loose board by the window. She knelt to that board. She had known it her whole life. It had always given a little under a bare foot, and she had never once turned her mind toward it. Now, with her fingers laid along the crack, she turned her whole mind toward it at once. She fetched the pry bars. She had slept 2 nights with across her lap, and she worked the flat end down into the seam and lifted, gentle, the way you lift the edge of a scab off a wound that has nearly finished healing. And the board came up with a soft complaint of old nails. Beneath it lay a shallow space between the joists, and in the shallow space sat a small tin box, the kind that had once held loose tea, its lid rusted fast to the body. Della lifted the tin out and set it on the floor. She did not open it. Her hands had begun to shake, and she did not want to open a second sealed thing with shaking hands. She fitted the board back into place. She stood. She carried the tin to the table and set it down beside the Bible, and now there were 3 things waiting on her instead of 1. The crate and the Bible and the little rusted tin, and each of them held a piece of an answer she was not certain she was ready to assemble. Outside on Wren Lane a wagon rolled past, and she heard the driver cluck his tongue to the team, and the ordinary sound of it steadied her more than any prayer could have. She went out to the pump for more water, and the bucket knocked companionably against her knee as she walked, a small dumb comfort of tin and rope, and she caught herself talking to it under her breath, telling it what she had found and what she meant to do next, the way her father had used to reason aloud to his old blue mule, whenever he was working a hard thought down to its bones. She fed the stove another split. She set water on to boil. She sat in her father's chair with the crate and the tin and the open Bible arranged before her, like the points of a triangle she stood at the center of, and she waited for her hands to come back to steady. When they had, she rose and went to the shed and carried in the loose-headed maul and set to mending it, because her hands needed a task that was not the opening of what she was not yet prepared to open, and because her grandmother who had shaped the name on the crate had raised a daughter, who had raised a son who had raised her, and not one soul in that whole line had ever once left a good tool broken when it lay within their power to make it whole. She drove the wedge home true. The head seated itself firm on the handle. She hung the maul back on its peg. The light in the window had turned by then to the color of pale honey, warmth waking behind the pale of it, and she thought, not yet, but soon now, very soon. She waited until the light in the front window ran the deep gold of a hen's egg held up to the sun, warmth standing plain behind the color, and then she knelt down at the crate. She set the lantern on the floor beside her, though the room hardly needed it now. She wanted the small steady flame near her hand, a companion for whatever came. She fitted the pry bar under the pine lid, where the nails had already worked loose across the long miles of freight road, and she drew the iron up slow, hearing each nail give the way an old man gives up a grudge he has held. Too long 1 grain of wood at a time. She did not hurry. She thought of her grandmother's hand shaping the name Ashcroft on that lid, and of that same hand pressing ink into the family Bible year upon year. And she understood that whatever lay packed inside had been packed by a woman who had never once hurried at anything, and that to tear it open now would be a kind of insult to all that patience. The lid came free. Della lifted it clear and leaned it against the wall. She did not look yet. She kept her eyes down on the floorboards a moment, breathing, gathering herself, and then she raised them to the open box. Straw, that was the first of it. Loose winter straw packed close and gone the color of old brass. She lifted a handful and set it aside. Beneath the straw lay a folded square of oilcloth, waxed dark against the wet of the road. Beneath the oilcloth lay a leather satchel, worn pale white along every seam, and tucked into the corners around the satchel sat smaller bundles wrapped in muslin and tied off with string. Della lifted each thing out one at a time and laid it on the floor around her knees, careful and deliberate, as though she were setting a table for a guest who had been expected for a very long time and was finally, that evening, coming home. She opened the satchel first. Inside lay papers, real papers, the substance of a life set down in ink. A deed on heavy stock folded 3 times, the writing on it still black and legible. A brand registration for a mark she did not know. A letter S drawn long and lazy across a horizontal bar. A bill of sale for 40 head of cattle sold in a town whose name she had never once heard spoken. And beneath all of those, bound with a green ribbon faded nearly to gray, a thick bundle of letters. The topmost was addressed in her grandmother's unmistakable hand to a name that stopped her cold. She untied the ribbon with fingers that had gone clumsy and opened the first letter and read it by the honey-colored light falling through the window. The letter opened with a single word, brother. Della read the word twice before it would fit itself into the shape of the world. Her grandmother had written to Silas Thorne, the outlaw, the Badlands ghost, the name whispered after dark for 40 years, and she had opened the letter by calling him brother. She read on with her heart going hard against her ribs. Her grandmother wrote of a child born safe through a difficult winter. She wrote of a fence mended and a well dug deeper. She wrote of the price of flour and the failure of the fall rains. She wrote of a posse that had come through in October asking after him and been sent on its way with empty hands and emptier answers. She wrote that the land at the head of the valley stood in her name now, held in trust, held for him, held against such a day as the trouble might finally be done, and a man could come home to his own country without a rope, waiting at the end of the road. She signed it with a single initial, the letter M. The same M Della had seen 100 times pressed inside the cover of the Bible and never once thought to wonder over. Della set the letter down on the floorboard and laid her palm flat against the wood to feel something solid underneath her. Silas Thorne, the outlaw 4 decades dead, whose name this whole town had carried only as a threat to frighten children or a joke to shame the poor, had been her grandmother's own brother, her own blood, reaching back across the better part of a century. And the land at the head of the valley, the dry claim her father had chased and cursed. For 10 hard years, the very ground Amos Kettering had named that morning with such careful and casual warning had never been a dry claim at all. It had been held land, kept back and kept faith with for 40 years by a run of ink and blood, and it had come down now, through a woman 11 years in her grave, to her. She opened the muslin bundles next, one by one. In the first lay a small revolver, oiled and wrapped and empty of every cartridge, a note pinned to the cloth in her grandmother's hand that read only, his, do not sell. In the second lay a tintype of a young man in a dark coat, mustached and unsmiling, staring into the camera across all the years between. And Della caught her breath, because the eyes looking back at her out of that faded plate were her father's eyes. And they were also, unmistakably, her own. In the third bundle lay a lock of dark hair, bound with a twin of the green ribbon. In the fourth, heavier in her hands than the rest, lay a canvas pouch, and when she loosened the throat of it and looked inside, she found gold coins, honest and dull in the lantern light. Not a fortune and not a pittance, but the slow, patient savings of a person who had earned in the open and been forced to hoard in secret. She poured them into her palm and counted, and there were enough to clear the note on the house, and enough left over besides to see her through a hard winter. And the knowledge of it moved through her chest like the first thaw moving through frozen ground. Then she lifted the little tin box from the table and worked its rusted lid free with the tip of the pry bar. Inside, folded once, lay a single sheet in her grandmother's hand, and the date at the top of it fell in the year before the year the old woman died. Della held it up to the honey light and read, Della, it began, and she nearly dropped it to see her own name written by a hand that had gone to dust before she was old enough to remember its owner's face. If it is you who has found this, then the others are all gone on ahead, and the ledger has come down at last to you. Your great-uncle was not the black thing the town made of him. He was not everything a man ought to have been, either. I will not pretty him for you past the truth, but he was ours, and what was taken from him was taken by liars, and the land at the head of the valley is ours by every right that matters. Keep it. Do not sell it. Do not stand in the road and explain yourself to people who have already decided what you are. Live on it, and let the living be your answer. That was the whole of it. Della read it through twice, then folded it along its worn crease and set it atop the open Bible and closed her eyes and let the last of the day's honey light lie warm across her face. Outside, the wind that had been only a thin thread under the door all day began to gather itself into something with shoulders. She heard it change its voice in the eaves, heard the loose shutter start up its knocking again, and this time keep at it. When she opened her eyes, the gold had drained out of the window and left it the flat pewter of a coming storm, and the first hard grain of ice ticked against the glass, and then a second, and then a scattering. And Della understood that the weather she had smelled, coming off the creek 2 days back, had finally arrived to test the house, and everyone the house was keeping. She did not sit and marvel at what she had found. She had her grandmother's blood in her, and that blood did not sit when there was work standing in front of it. She banked the stove and brought in what wood remained in the shed. 3 armloads carried against her chest, with her chin clamped down on the topmost piece to hold the stack. She filled the bucket at the pump while the ice was still only ice, and had not yet become the driving white wall she could feel building behind it. She carried the water in and set it by the stove and shut the door hard against the rising wind and dropped the bar across it. The house creaked once, low and long, the way a boat creaks settling onto its mooring, and then it held. Della sat down in her father's chair, with the Bible open across her knees and the letters gathered back inside its cover, and the empty revolver on the table within reach of her hand, and she watched the window go from pewter to slate to black, and she listened to the storm find its full voice out over the valley. The wind came down out of the north, the way it does only 2 or 3 times in a hard winter, mean and steady and tireless, and the ice turned to snow that flew sideways past the glass and stacked against the base of the door in a slow blue drift. She could hear building even when she could not see it. She rationed the wood. She sat close to the stove and read her great-uncle's life by lantern light, letter after letter, learning the man by the slow accumulation of small certainties. She learned that he had run cattle honest for years under that lazy S brand, before the trouble ever found him. She learned that the trouble, when it came, had worn the respectable face of another family in the valley, a family that had wanted his water and his grass, and had found it cheaper to hang a name on him than to buy him out. She learned that her grandmother had believed to the end of her days that the truth of it would keep the way good seed keeps until the season came round at last that was ready to receive it. A little past what she judged to be midnight, over the steady roar of the storm, Della heard a sound that did not belong to the wind. A knock. Then a second knock, harder. Then a voice, thinned to almost nothing by the gale, calling out any name that might be sheltering inside, calling for help in the plain, unguarded way people call only when they have run all the way to the end of their own strength. She was on her feet before she had decided to stand. She crossed to the door and lifted the bar and hauled it open against the shove of the wind. And there on her step stood 2 figures caked white and hunched against the cold. A woman with a shawl frozen stiff over her hair and bundled inside that shawl against her chest. A small child of perhaps 4 years, wide-eyed and shivering but blessedly, loudly complaining about the cold, in the way only a child with plenty of strength left in her will complain. Behind them on the road a horse stood with its head hung low, and behind the horse a wagon canted hard onto one broken wheel where a drift had swallowed it whole. Della did not waste a breath on questions. She took the child first, because the child was nearest and lightest, and swung her inside and set her down on the rug close to the stove, then reached back and got the woman by the elbow and drew her over the threshold and put her shoulder to the door until it shut and the bar dropped home. The wind's voice fell by half the moment the door was closed, and in the sudden relative quiet, the child's fussing sounded almost cheerful, the healthy outrage of a small person who has been cold and wet and is now neither. She unwound the frozen shawl from around the little girl and rubbed the small hands between her own until the pink came back into them, murmuring the sort of nonsense her father had once murmured to her. And the child quieted and then, warmed and safe and worn out, began to nod toward sleep before the stove. Della hung the stiff shawl over a chair back to steam and thaw. She poured the last of the thin coffee into a cup and folded the woman's stiff fingers around it and held them there until they could hold on their own. The woman drank, and the color came slowly back into her lips, and the shivering that had racked her began to ease. Her man had gone on ahead, the woman managed at last, her voice a raw scrape. Gone for help, when the wheel broke better than an hour back. Maybe more. He'd meant to reach the town and send someone before the worst of it came down. Della looked at the door, and at the stove, and at the child now sleeping soundly on the rug, with one fist tucked under her cheek, and at the woman whose hands had only just steadied enough to lift the cup. She thought of the wood she had carried in, which would not see 3 people through a night, like the one now howling against the walls. She thought of the shed 15 paces off, through the blizzard, where the unsplit rounds still stood silvered and gray in the dark. And she thought of the last line of her grandmother's letter, 3 words that had lodged in her like a seed in soft ground. Live on it. She put on her father's heavy coat. She wound the hay-colored scarf twice around her face until only her eyes showed. She took the newly mended maul down from its peg and lifted the lantern from where it sat, and she told the woman to feed the stove small pieces, slow and steady, to make the little wood last, and the woman nodded, understanding, already reaching for the split pine. Then Della lifted the bar and stepped out into the storm. The shed stood 15 paces from the back door, and those 15 paces took her the better part of forever, the wind hauling at her coat and driving the fine snow into every seam and gap. She reached the shed and set the lantern on the bench where its light would not be smothered. And she split rounds by that small stubborn flame with the wind screaming at her back. And she split more than 3 people could burn in a night, because she had decided somewhere in the crossing that this family would not go cold while she had an arm left to swing. She carried the wood back in armload by armload, 4 crossings in all, and on each crossing there came a moment, halfway between the shed and the door, when it would have been the easier thing by far to turn her face out of the wind and simply stop, simply let the white take her down into its terrible soft quiet. 4 times the thought came to her, and 4 times she set her jaw and made the door. Courage, she understood somewhere in that white dark, was not the absence of the easy way out. It was walking past it again and again until you were home. On the last crossing, she did not go straight in. She stopped at the road where the ruined wagon lay drowning in the drift, and she unbuckled the frozen harness with fingers she could no longer feel. And she got the exhausted horse loose and led it stumbling into the lean-to at the side of the house and threw a horse blanket over its shaking back and left it there, with its head pressed to the boards, out of the wind, breathing hard and alive. When she came in the final time and barred the door behind her, the child slept on undisturbed on the rug, and the woman had built the fire up small and steady, exactly as she had been shown, a patient orange heart glowing behind the stove door. Della set down the last of the wood and then sat down hard on the floor beside it, because her legs had reached the end of what they were willing to do. Snow melted off her in a widening dark ring on the boards. She had stopped being able to feel her own hands somewhere out by the wagon, and she flexed them now near the heat and waited for the fire to give them back to her. "We'll make it to morning," she said, and she had not meant to say it out loud, but the words came anyway, quiet and certain, more promise than prayer. The woman watched her across the small, warm room. This stranger in a dead man's coat, who had gone out 4 times into a killing storm for people whose names she had not yet even asked, and something in the woman's face broke gently open. "We will," she answered, and the 2 words carried a weight of gratitude that no coin could ever have matched. And the child slept on between them, safe and warm and breathing easy, while the storm spent its long fury against the walls of a house that had been built, and held, and kept in trust across 40 patient years. for exactly such a night as this. Morning came white and utterly still, the storm spent somewhere in the last black hours of the night. And Della woke on the floorboards with her father's coat still buttoned to her throat, and one arm gone numb beneath her. For a moment she did not know what had pulled her up out of sleep. Then she heard it again, the crunch of boots breaking a crust of snow, deliberate and heavy, coming down Wren Lane toward the house. She was on her feet before her mind had fully caught up to her body. The way a person moves, when trouble has taught them that the first second belongs to whoever is ready for it. The woman was already at the window, her palm flat against the cold glass, and when she spoke a man's name low under her breath there was such relief in it that Della understood the danger of the night had not, for this family, ended with the sunrise. She drew the bar and opened the door. The man who came in stamping snow from his boots did not speak at first. He only looked at his wife in the chair, and at the child asleep and Rosie on the rug, with her fist tucked beneath her cheek, and at Della standing there in a dead man's coat, with the melt still dark on the shoulders of it. Whatever he had rehearsed on the long walk back deserted him entirely. He crossed the room and took Della's hand in both of his, and his hands were still half frozen, and he held on as though her hand were the only solid thing left in a world that had nearly tipped him off its edge. The horse, she told him, was in the lean-to, blanketed and alive. He nodded, unable to answer, and went out to see to it, and when he came back his eyes were wet, and he no longer tried to hide it. His name was Corwin Bell, and he had walked the last 2 miles into Harrow's Bend, through the worst of the wind after the wheel gave out, hammering on doors that stayed shut against a stranger's voice in a storm, until the smith had finally taken him in and kept him from freezing on the step. He had spent the black hours certain he had led his family into a drift they would not walk out of, and he had come back at first light bracing for the worst a man can brace for. Instead, he had found them warm. He learned that fact the way a man learns he has been forgiven a debt he could never have paid. And he did not have words equal to it, so he stopped trying to find them, and simply sat down heavily on the looking's floor and beside his sleeping daughter and put his hand on her small back to feel it rise and fall. By afternoon, the drifts had settled and hardened enough that a man could break a trail through them, and word of the night traveled out from the house on Wren Lane the way word always traveled in that town, faster than any horse could have carried it. Corwin went first to the mercantile, and then to the smithy, and then to the little church at the end of the street. And at every door he told the same thing, that a girl alone on Wren Lane had gone out again and again into a storm that had nearly finished a grown man, and had split wood by lantern light past the point where her own hands stopped answering her, all to keep a stranger's child warm through the dark. He told it plainly, without ornament, because the truth of it needed no ornament, and the town that had laughed at Della 2 days before did not quite know what to do with the shape of it. Hetty closed the mercantile in the middle of a business day, which she had not done in living memory, and came down the frozen lane with a basket of eggs packed in straw and a paper twist of the good dark coffee she kept behind the counter for customers who could pay, and she set them on Della's table and would not hear a word about payment. The depot boy, whose name Della finally learned was Tom Sattler, arrived dragging a sled stacked with split pine he had cut himself, and he would take nothing for it either. He looked once at the open crate still standing in the middle of the front room, at the straw and the oilcloth and the leather satchel arranged around it, and something moved behind his young face, but he did not ask. He touched the brim of his cap to her, the way men in that country touched their hats to women they respected, and he went back out into the cold. 2 days earlier, that same boy had hollered across the water trough about a dead man in her parlor. She marked the change and said nothing about it, because she had learned already that the surest way to lose new ground was to point at it. Corwin Bell would not leave until the road to the county seat had been broken clear. And while he waited, he made himself useful in the 100 small ways a grateful man finds, mending the sagging rail fence her father had left undone, resetting a hinge on the lean-to door, splitting the rounds Della had hauled in until the pile behind the stoves stood higher than it had all winter. His wife, whose name was Ada, kept the little girl close and helped Della boil the eggs and grind Hetty's coffee. And for the first time since she had climbed down off the freighter's wagon, the house on Wren Lane held the ordinary music of more than one life being lived inside it. The child, whose name was June, took to following Della from room to room on unsteady legs. And once she reached up without warning and put her whole small hand flat against Della's cheek, the way children do when they have decided a person is safe. And Della had to turn away toward the window until the sting behind her eyes had passed. It was Ada who told her, on the second evening, the thing that changed the shape of everything. They were sitting close to the stove with June asleep between them, when Ada asked, careful and quiet, what a young woman living alone meant to do, with a crate of papers she could not read the law of. And Della admitted she did not rightly know, that she had deeds and letters and a brand registration, and no earthly idea how to make any of it stand up against a man who held her mortgage and coveted her land. Ada set down her cup. Her uncle, she said, was a lawyer out of the county seat, a careful and honest man named Nathaniel Price, and he owed her people more than one good turn. And when the road opened, she meant to send for him herself, because a girl who had done what Della had done in that storm ought not to be left alone with a stack of papers and a wolf at her gate. Della looked at this stranger she had pulled in out of the snow 2 nights before and understood that the hand she had reached into the storm had, without her knowing it, it closed around a rope that led somewhere she badly needed to go. The next morning, Amos Kettering rode down Wren Lane on the same well-fed horse, in the same coat that had never known a hard rain, and he stopped at the gate, and he did not dismount. Della went out to meet him with her braid down her back and her father's coat still on her shoulders, because it had become, over 3 cold nights, less her father's coat than her own. Kettering looked at her a long moment, and then he took off his hat and held it against his chest, and the gesture sat wrong on him, like a borrowed thing that did not fit. He had heard about the papers, he said. Della told him only that yes, there were papers. He looked past her at the smoke rising straight and clean from the stovepipe into the washed pewter sky, and for a moment something almost like regret crossed the flat surface of his face, and then it was gone, smoothed over, because men like Amos Kettering did not let a feeling stand long enough to be read. The note on the house, he said. Della told him she could pay it. I know you can, he answered, and there was something folded carefully inside the words, some edge, that made her go still and listen underneath them. He knew a great deal, that tone told her. He had always known more than he let a person see. He set his hat back on his head and turned his horse and rode away up Wren Lane slower than he had come. And Della stood at the gate and understood, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the weather, that the man had not ridden down to make peace. He had ridden down to measure her, to see how much she had learned and how much she had not, and to reckon what it would cost him to take back what he had spent 40 years believing would fall to him unclaimed. She was right to have read him so. 3 days later, when the road to the county seat had been broken open by a dozen wagons and the first thaw had turned the ruts to a churn of mud and ice, a rider came down from the courthouse with a folded paper sealed in wax, and he handed it across the gate to Della and would not meet her eye as he did it. She broke the seal standing in the cold and read it once, and then a second time, slower, because the words seemed to slide out of true the first time through. It was a notice of claim. Amos Kettering had filed papers at the county seat, asserting that the land at the head of the valley, the land held 40 years in a dead woman's name, belonged rightfully to the Kettering family, and that any competing claim was clouded, disputed, and subject to the ruling of a hearing to be held before the county land commissioner within the month. Della read the notice a third time at the table with the lantern lit, and the cold that came into her was not the cold of the storm, but something older and deeper, the cold of understanding that the fight she had thought was ending had in fact only just declared itself. Ada found her there and read the paper over her shoulder, and her mouth set into a hard line. This, she said quietly, is not a thing you fight alone. and it is not a thing you fight without Nathaniel. She would leave at first light for the county seat. She and Corwin both, and they would bring her uncle back. And Della was not to sign anything, agree to anything, or say a single word to Amos Kettering until a man who knew the law stood at her side. Della folded the notice and set it inside the cover of the Bible, atop the letters, where all the weight of her family's held secrets already lay, and she thought that the ledger her grandmother had spoken of was still open after all, still being written in, and that the next entries would be hers to make. The Bells left the following dawn, June bundled in a coat Della had cut down from one of her own and stitched to fit through the small hours of the night, because the child had come to them with nothing warm enough for the mountains, and Della could not bear to send her back out into the cold half-clothed. Ada took Della's hands at the gate and made her a promise that whatever it cost and however long it took, her family would not forget who had gone out into the storm for them, and that Nathaniel Price would be standing in this yard within the week, or she would know the reason why. Then the mended wagon rolled up Wren Lane and out toward the broken road east, and Della stood in the yard until it had gone from sight. And for the first time, the empty house did not feel like a punishment, but like a thing she was keeping ready. She did not spend the waiting days idle. Her grandmother's letter had told her to let the living be her answer, and she took the instruction as a woman takes a tool that has been left her by someone who knew the work. She rode out to the head of the valley on Tom Sattler's borrowed mare through country, still stunned white by the storm. And she stood in grass that had been beaten flat by the snow and would rise again, green in the spring, beside a creek that ran clear and quick even in the deep of the cold, fed by some spring high in the hills that did not freeze. She understood then, standing in that thin bright air, what her grandmother had held on to for 40 years, and for whom and against what. It was not dry land. It had never been dry land. The dryness had been a story, told and retold until the town believed it. And a story told long enough becomes a kind of fence, keeping the true thing safe inside it. Her father had chased the story his whole life and died believing it. And the cruelest part of all of it was that the water he had needed had been running clear and cold not 2 miles from his own door the entire time. She walked the boundaries as her grandmother's deed had described them. A stone cairn at the north corner, half tumbled by weather. A lightning-split cottonwood marking the east, the creek itself running the western line, and at the south corner, where the deed said she would find an iron pin driven deep. She dug through the crusted snow with her bare hands until she struck it. There it was, a length of the very iron she had found, leaning in her father's shed, cut clean at one end, driven into the frozen earth of the valley by a hand 40 years gone. She knelt in the snow beside it, with her cold fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and understood at last why the band in the shed had been cut. It had been cut to make this. Her great-uncle, or her grandmother acting for him, had marked the corner of the land with iron from the same batch that bound the crate, so that whoever came after would find the proof driven into the ground itself, where no liar's paper could ever reach it. Nothing about this claim had been left to chance. Every piece of it had been made to survive exactly the kind of attack now bearing down on it. That certainty carried her back down the valley, with her spine straighter than it had gone up. But the certainty did not last the night. When she came back into town in the blue dusk, she found a knot of men outside the mercantile, and they went quiet as she passed the way men go quiet when they have been speaking of the person who arrives. And one of them, an older rancher named Hollis Dean, who ran cattle on the flats east of town, called out to her, not unkindly but with a warning threaded plain through it. She ought to know. He told her that Kettering had been in the mercantile that afternoon, buying drinks, and telling anyone who would take one that the Ashcroft girls' papers were forgeries, that no dead outlaw had ever owned an acre of good valley land, and that a clever girl had cooked up a story out of an old crate to try to steal ground. Honest men had worked for 2 generations. The town had been ready to think well of her for one long shining moment after the storm. Kettering, with money and drink, and the patient malice of a man who had waited 40 years, was working hard to spend that goodwill back down to nothing before Price could ever arrive. Della stood in the cold and understood the shape of what she was up against, and it was worse than a paper filed at a courthouse. Kettering did not merely mean to beat her claim in a hearing. He meant to poison the whole town against her first, so that even if the law found in her favor, she would be left holding land in a place that had decided she was a thief. She thanked Hollis Dean for the warning, because he had not owed her one, and she walked home down Wren Lane in the dark with her jaw set. And somewhere on that walk the fear that had been riding her chest since she broke the courthouse seal turned into something harder and more useful. A lie repeated in a warm room over free whiskey was a powerful thing. But her grandmother had understood something about lies that Kettering had forgotten. A lie has to be fed and fed to keep its legs under it. The truth can lie quiet in a crate for 40 years and lose none of its strength. She woke before light the next morning with an idea already whole in her mind. The way her father used to wake with the answer to a problem he had gone to bed unable to solve. If Kettering was going to try her claim in the mercantile and the church and the smithy, before ever a commissioner heard a word of it, then she would not wait in her house to be talked about. She would carry the truth out into the same rooms he was working, not by arguing, because a young woman arguing with a rich man's whiskey would only prove his point, but by laying the plain proof on the counter and letting honest eyes do the rest. And she would go and see the one person left in Harrow's Bend, old enough to remember the autumn of 1844, old enough to have watched Silas Thorne ride out with a posse behind him, old enough perhaps to know which part of the story the town had been telling was true and which part had been sold to it. She went to find Elias Ward. He was not on his bench outside the smithy, the cold having driven even him indoors. But the smith told her where the old man kept his room, a narrow lean-to attached to the back of the livery, where he had lived rent-free for years, in exchange for whatever small work his hands could still do. Della knocked, and after a long silence, a voice told her to come in out of the cold before she let all the heat out, and she stepped into a low, dim room that smelled of pipe smoke and liniment and old paper, and found Elias Ward sitting in a chair by a small iron stove, with a blanket over his knees and his pale eyes turned toward the door, as though he had been expecting her for some time. He did not seem surprised to see her. He gestured with one knotted hand toward a stool by the stove, and Della sat, and for a while neither of them spoke, the old man studying her face in the firelight, the way a man studies a hand of cards he has not yet decided how to play. She had come, she told him at last, because he had said a thing to her on the road she had not been able to set down since, that what was buried was never the same as what was lost. And she had come to believe he had not been speaking in riddles at all, but telling her plainly to dig. Ward's mouth moved at one corner, not quite a smile. She was quicker than her father, he told her, and quicker than most, and that was either going to save her or get her hurt, and he was too old to guess which. Then he told her a thing that turned the whole floor of the story out from under her. He had been a young man in 1844, he said, no more than 20, working the Kettering outfit for wages, because in those days, the Ketterings were the only outfit in the valley big enough to hire. He had been there the autumn the trouble came to a head, and he had seen with his own two eyes the thing the town had spent 40 years agreeing to forget. Silas Thorne had held the head of the valley and the only reliable water in a dry country, and old Josiah Kettering, Amos's grandfather, had wanted that water the way a man wants the one thing standing between his ambition and its completion. There had been no cattle stolen. There had been no stagecoach robbed. The whole tale of Thorne the Outlaw had been built in a single season out of a forged bill of sale, a bribed witness, and a warrant sworn out before a territorial judge who owed Josiah Kettering money. The posse that rode out after Silas Thorne had not been chasing a thief. It had been chasing an inconvenient, honest man off land his neighbor meant to have. Della sat very still on the stool with the fire ticking in the stove and the old man's words settling into her one by one like stones dropped into deep water. Then why, she asked him when her voice would come, had he never told it? Why had he let the town go on frightening children with a good man's name for 40 years? Ward looked at her a long moment, and something old and tired and ashamed moved through his pale eyes. Because he had been young, he told her, and poor, and afraid, and Josiah Kettering had made it plain what happened to men who remembered the wrong things out loud. He had told himself the truth would keep. He had told himself he would speak it when it was safe. Then the years had gone by the way years do, and Silas Thorne was gone and presumed dead, and there had seemed no one left the truth could help. And a man gets so used to the weight of a thing he carries that he forgets he could ever set it down. He had watched her push that crate home by lantern light, and he had known the way you know weather coming, that the season the truth had been keeping for had finally arrived, and that he was the last man alive who could water the seed her grandmother had planted. He would testify, he told her, before she had even finished forming the question. He was old, and he had little enough time left to lose, and he had carried Josiah Kettering's lie on his back for 40 years, and he found he would rather set it down before he died than carry it into the ground. But she had to understand what she was asking of him and of herself. Amos Kettering was not his grandfather, but he was cut from the same cloth, and a man like that did not lose land quietly. If Elias Ward stood up in a hearing and named the Kettering family as forgers and thieves reaching back 2 generations, then everything Amos had built his standing on came apart in public, and a cornered man of that kind would do things a comfortable man never would. She was not merely fighting for a claim anymore. She was pulling the foundation stone out from under the most powerful family in the county, and she had best be certain she was ready for what came down when it fell. Della walked home from the livery in the early dark, with the old man's testimony sitting in her chest like a live coal, warm and dangerous both. She had come looking for a memory and found a weapon, and the trouble with a weapon was that once you picked it up, you could no longer pretend you had a choice about the fight. She could still, even now, take the pouch of gold and pay the note on the house and let the land at the head of the valley go. Let Kettering have his water and his lie and his 40-year victory and live small and quiet and safe. Her grandmother had foreseen even that temptation. Do not stand in the road and explain yourself to people who have already decided what you are. But she had not written, let them keep what they stole. She had written, keep it. And Della understood the difference now as she had not fully understood it before. Keeping the land was not about the water or the grass. It was about refusing to let a lie be the last word spoken over her family's name. The days that followed stretched thin and taut as a wire strung between 2 posts. Kettering did not come to the house again, which was worse than if he had, because Della could feel him working out beyond her sight, in rooms she was not in, on people she could not reach. A man who had nodded to her at the pump the week before turned his shoulder now. Hetty grew careful and quiet again behind her counter. Not unkind, but pulled taut between her fondness for the girl and her fear of the family that could ruin her business with a word. The tide that had turned toward Della after the storm was being turned back, patiently, dollar by dollar, and doubt by doubt, and she had no way to stop it but to wait for Price and the truth to arrive together. And the waiting was its own kind of cold. Then, on the 6th day, 2 things happened within an hour of each other, and together they nearly finished her. The first was that Tom Sattler came running down Wren Lane in the middle of the afternoon, breathless, to tell her a fire had broken out in the livery in the night, small and quickly beaten down by the smith who slept nearby, but that it had started in the lean-to where Elias Ward kept his room, and that the old man had been helped out coughing and shaken but whole, and taken to the smith's own house to be looked after. No one could quite say how a fire started in the room of a careful old man who had not lit his stove that night because the day had turned mild. No one could say it, but Della stood in her doorway with Tom's words ringing in her ears and understood exactly what she was looking at. And so did every other soul in Harrow's Bend, which was precisely the point. The fire had not been meant to harm Elias Ward. It had been meant to remind him, and everyone watching, what happened to old men who decided to remember the wrong things out loud. The second thing happened before her. heart had even settled from the first. A boy she did not know rode in on a lathered pony from the direction of the county seat and asked for the Ashcroft place, and when Tom pointed him down the lane, he delivered his message and would not stay for coffee. Nathaniel Price had been delayed. There had been a matter at the county seat, some sudden legal tangle that had come up out of nowhere and required his presence before a judge, and he could not leave until it was settled, and he could not say for certain when that would be. He sent his regrets and his counsel to sign nothing and wait, and Della stood in the yard holding the boy's crumpled note and understood that this delay was no accident of the calendar any more than the fire had been an accident of the stove. Kettering had reached all the way to the county seat and found a way to tie up the one lawyer who might have stood between the Ashcroft girl and the loss of everything, and he had done it in the same week. He lit a fire under the one witness who could sink him. The man was not waiting for the hearing. He was clearing the field before it started. Della went that evening to the Smith's house to see Elias Ward with her own eyes, because she could not carry the fear of what the fire had done to him a moment longer than she had to. She found him propped up in a borrowed bed with a rattle still in his breath and his pale eyes red-rimmed from the smoke, but his mind clear and his temper, if anything, sharpened by what had been done to him. He waved off her worry before she could fully speak it. A fire in an old man's room, he told her, his voice a dry rasp, was the surest sign in the world that a rich man was frightened, and a frightened rich man made mistakes a comfortable one never would. He had spent 40 years afraid of the Ketterings. He found, lying in that bed with the smell of smoke still in his clothes, that he was not afraid anymore, that they had finally done the one thing that burned the fear right out of him, and that he would say what he had seen in 1844 in front of God and the county commissioner and every soul in Harrow's Bend if he had to be carried into the hearing on a plank to do it. But the fire and the delay together had done real damage, and Della would not let the old man's courage blind her to it. Price was tangled up at the county seat with no certain day of release. The one witness she had was old and shaken, and might not have the strength to sit through a hearing when it came. The town's sympathy was ebbing back toward the family that signed the notes and paid the wages and owned the future, and the hearing itself now stood only days off, a date fixed and immovable, rushing toward her like a wagon with a broken brake. She walked home through the frozen dark with all of it piled onto her at once, and for the length of that walk, the weight of it very nearly bent her double, because she was 19 years old and alone against a man who could reach into a courthouse 50 miles away and tie a lawyer's hands, who could put a fire in an old man's room and have the whole town understand the message without a word of it ever being spoken aloud. She stopped in the road halfway home, in the dark, and made herself stand there until she had stopped shaking. Then she thought of the iron driven deep into the frozen corner of the valley, where no lie could reach it. She thought of her grandmother's hand, shaping the truth into ink year after year, keeping faith with a brother the whole world had agreed to forget. She thought of the words in the tin box, ours by every right that matters, and she understood that she came from a line of people who had been outnumbered and outspent and lied about before, and who had not folded, who had simply set the truth down somewhere safe, and kept living until the day came it could be picked back up. Kettering had money and reach and a town half-turned. She had a crate of proof, an old man who had stopped being afraid, and a family 50 miles east who had promised, through the mouth of a woman she'd pulled out of a snowdrift, that they would not forget. It was not nothing. Her grandmother had made certain it would never be nothing. She reached her own gate and stood a moment looking at the dark house, and then she made the decision that would carry her into the worst and the best of what was coming. She would not spend the last days before the hearing hiding in that house, waiting to be rescued by a lawyer who might not come in time. If Kettering could work the town while she waited, then she could work it too, and she had one thing he could never match, which was that every word she meant to say was true, and the truth, once it was finally let out of its crate, had 40 years of held silence pushing it forward. The daylight campaign began the next morning, before the frost had even lifted from the window glass, with Della walking into the mercantile with the leather satchel under her arm and the tintype in her coat pocket. Hetty looked up from her ledger with something caught between hope and dread on her face, because she knew as well as anyone what it meant for the Ashcroft girl to walk in carrying papers while half the town had been drinking Kettering's whiskey and swallowing his story. Della did not ask her to take a side. She only asked if she might set a few things on the counter where the morning light fell clean through the front window. And Hetty, after a glance at the empty store, nodded and cleared a space among the bolts of cloth. Della laid them out without hurry. The deed on its heavy stock, the black ink still legible after 40 years. The brand registration with its long lazy S drawn across the bar. The topmost letter, unfolded to show the single word that opened it. And beside them, last, the tintype of the young man in the dark coat, his eyes fixed forever on some point past the camera. Eyes that Hetty had seen 1,000 times, looking out of Della's own face and out of her father's before her. Hetty bent over the counter and read, and her lips moved through the words of the letter, and when she reached the place where a dead woman had called an outlaw brother, her hand rose to her mouth and stayed there. She had known Margaret Ashcroft, she said at last, her voice unsteady. She had known that hand. There was no forging that hand. No clever girl on earth could have counterfeited the way Margaret Ashcroft crossed her letters, and anyone in this valley old enough to have had a note from her in life would know it on sight. That was the thing Della had understood in the small hours and staked everything on. Kettering could buy whiskey and doubt, but he could not buy back the memory of a woman who had lived among these people for 60 years and written their marriage records and their children's names into her Bible when they had no Bible of their own. The truth did not need Della to argue it. It only needed to be set down in the light where honest eyes could fall on it, and the eyes would do the rest. She gathered the papers back into the satchel and thanked Hetty and went on to the next door, and the next, all through the cold, bright morning, laying the same evidence on the same kind of counter for the same kind of stunned silence, letting each person come to the truth the way a person comes to cold water, slow at first, and then all at once. By noon, the current in the town had begun to turn a second time, but it turned against a rising wind, because Kettering was not a man who let his ground be taken without answer. Word reached Della as she came out of the smith's shop, where she had shown the papers to the man who had pulled Elias Ward from the smoke, that Kettering had ridden in from his ranch and gone straight to the little clapboard building that served the county as its local land office, and that he had been closeted there the better part of an hour with the clerk who kept the records. She did not have to wonder long what he was doing behind that door. A man whose family had forged a bill of sale 2 generations back to steal a valley was not above adjusting a record book to keep it. She went to the land office herself, because waiting to learn what he had done felt worse than facing it, and she found the door barred and a hand-lettered card in the window, saying the office was closed until the day of the hearing by order of the clerk. Closed. Days before a land dispute was to be decided on the strength of what those very records held. The records had been locked away where no one but the clerk and the man who had spent an hour with him could touch them. Della stood on the frozen step and felt the cold travel all the way up through her boots into her chest, because she understood that the fight was no longer only about what her grandmother had written. It was about whether the county's own books would be allowed to agree with her, or whether they would be quietly made to sing whatever tune Amos Kettering had paid for. She was still standing there when a voice spoke behind her, dry and rasping and unmistakable, and she turned to find Elias Ward on his feet in the road, wrapped in a borrowed coat too big for his shrunken frame, leaning on his hickory cane with the smith, hovering anxious at his elbow. He had heard about the office being shut, he told her, before she could scold him for being out of his sick bed in the cold. He had made the smith bring him. There were some things, he said, that a man could not lie in bed and let happen. Not if he meant to look at himself in a glass afterward. His breath still caught and rattled when he drew it deep, The smoke had done that and might not undo it, but his pale eyes had gone hard and clear as creek ice. And as Della understood that the fire meant to frighten him into silence had instead burned away, the last of whatever had kept him quiet for 40 years. He knew that clerk, Ward told her, lowering his voice though the street was empty. Knew his father before him. The Vance family had kept the county's records for 2 generations, and they had always kept them the way the biggest man in the valley wanted them kept. Because a records clerk in a small county lived or died on the goodwill of the men who owned the land. If Amos Kettering had spent an hour behind that door, then somewhere in those books a page had been changed, or was about to be, and the only question left was whether they could prove the change before the hearing or after, because after would be too late to matter. Ward's mouth pulled thin. The trouble with the truth, he said, was that a lie needed only to win once, on the right day, in the right room, to bury it for another 40 years. Della walked the old man back toward the Smith's house through the noon cold, matching her pace to his slow shuffle, her mind working the whole way. If the records were locked and likely already tampered with, then the county's books could no longer be trusted to prove her claim, which meant everything now rested on the 2 things Kettering could not reach: the papers in her satchel and the memory in Elias Ward's head. He had reached the lawyer at the county seat and tangled him. He had reached the clerk and locked the books. He had put a fire in Ward's room to frighten him quiet. Twice he had failed to stop the old man, but he had succeeded at the other 2. And Della understood with a sinking certainty that a man who had already reached that far would not stop reaching. If she was the one carrying the papers from door to door, then she was the loose thread he had left to pull, and a man like Amos Kettering did not leave loose threads. The warning, when it came gentle, which made it worse. That evening, as the light failed, Amos Kettering rode down Wren Lane and stopped at her gate, and this time he swung down heavy from the saddle to stand at her fence with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into a shape meant to look like concern. He had come, he told her, because whatever lay between them over the land, he did not wish to see a young woman come to harm, and it grieved him to watch her stir up a town that had been peaceful, digging into old sorrows better left to rest, setting herself against people with long memories and longer reach. It was a dangerous thing, he said softly, for a girl alone with no family and no man in the house to make herself the center of so much trouble. Accidents happened to people who went where they were not welcome. Fires started. Roads washed out. He would hate, he said, for anything to happen to her out on that lonely lane. Della stood on her own side of the fence and looked at the man who had lit an old man's room and locked a county's records and tied a lawyer's hands, and who now stood at her gate, telling her he feared for her safety. And she understood she was looking at the purest thing she had ever seen, a threat dressed so carefully as kindness that a lesser person might have thanked him for it. She did not thank him. She let a silence run out between them until it grew uncomfortable, until he shifted his weight, and then she told him, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, that her grandmother had held this land for 40 years against men exactly like him, that she had been raised by people who did not frighten, and that if he had ridden all the way down Wren Lane in the cold to learn whether the Ashcroft girl would fold, then he had wasted the trip. Because there was a name on that crate this valley had been afraid of for 40 years, and she had decided the town was done being afraid of the wrong things. Something moved across his face then, a flicker of the real man beneath the arranged concern, the cold calculation of someone reckoning that persuasion had failed and other means would have to serve. He put his hat back on. She would be sorry, he told her quietly, that she had not listened, and he mounted and rode back up the lane into the dark. Della barred her door that night with her grandmother's empty revolver on the table beside her, not because she believed she could ever use it against a man, but because the weight of it in the lamplight was the weight of her family's refusal to be moved, and she wanted that refusal close at hand. She did not sleep much. Twice in the night, she heard riders pass slow on the lane, unhurried, letting the hoofbeats carry to the house on purpose, a reminder that the threat was not idle and that she was watched. Each time she sat up in the dark with her hand near the cold iron and waited until the sound had faded, refusing to let the fear take root, telling herself that a man who meant true harm did not announce him with slow riders in the night, that this too was theater meant to break her nerve before the hearing. But theater or not, it worked its way into her, and by the gray of morning she had understood a hard thing, that she could not carry this fight alone, through the days and nights still left of it, that Kettering had chosen isolation as his weapon precisely because it worked, and that the one hope she had left lay 50 miles east, where a lawyer sat tangled in a knot she could not reach, and a family sat that had promised, through the mouth of a woman she had pulled from a snowdrift, that they would not forget. The break came from the direction she had stopped expecting it. On the third morning of her daylight campaign, with 2 days now standing between her and the hearing, a wagon came down the broken road from the east, faster than a wagon ought to come over ground that rough, and it drew up at her gate in a spray of half-frozen mud, and Corwin Bell climbed down from the seat before the wheels had fully stopped. He had not waited for the road to fully open. He had pushed the team through country still half buried, because Ada had learned something at the county seat that could not wait for good traveling weather. And he had come himself, rather than trust it to a messenger who might be turned back or bought off along the way. Ada had found her uncle, Corwin told her, standing in her yard with the mud drying on his coat, and his face grim with the news he carried. Nathaniel Price was not tangled in any honest legal matter at all. The sudden case that had chained him to the county seat had been brought by a man Price had never wronged, over a debt Price did not owe, and it had fallen apart under the first serious examination like wet paper, because it had never been a real case at all, only a device, a thing filed to hold a lawyer in place for exactly as long as Amos Kettering needed him held. Price had seen through it the moment Ada laid the whole story before him, the crate and the land, and the notice of claim in the name Kettering. He was free now, the false case dismissed, and he was coming, and he was bringing something with him that would change the shape of the hearing entirely. Della's heart rose and then caught, because Corwin's face had not lifted with the good news the way a man's face should. There was more, and the more was not good. Price had made inquiries, quietly, through men he trusted at the county seat, into the record of the Kettering family's claim to the valley, and what he had learned had chilled him. The original bill of sale, the forged paper on which the whole 40-year theft rested, had been filed with the territorial court back in 1844. And if a copy of it still existed anywhere beyond Kettering's reach, it would be in the territorial archive 50 miles north of the Capitol Road, the one set of records the Kettering family had never controlled, because they were kept too far off to be quietly managed. If that filing could be found and set beside her grandmother's letters and Elias Ward's testimony, then the lie would not merely be disputed, it would be destroyed at its root, proven false by the very paper meant to make it true. But the archive was 2 hard days' ride there and back. The roads were bad, and the hearing was 2 days off, and Price could not be in 2 places at once. He was coming to Harrow's Bend to stand at her side before the commissioner. Someone else would have to ride for the archive, and ride hard. And there was no guarantee the paper was still there to be found. Della understood, standing in her muddy yard with the winter sun thin on her face, that the fight had just narrowed to a race, and that she held the only hand that could run it. Price was needed at the hearing. Ward was too frail for hard travel and far too vital as a witness to risk on a road. Corwin had a family to see home safe. That left her. The land was hers, the crate was hers, the name on it was her blood. And now the ride was hers too, because there was no one else whose absence the town could afford and whose stake in it ran deep enough to carry them through 50 miles of bad road in winter, to find a single sheet of paper in an archive that might already have been emptied of it. She did not deliberate long. A thing that is truly yours, her grandmother's whole life had told her, is a thing you do not hand to someone else to save. She would ride, she told Corwin, and she watched him understand what she was proposing and start to argue against it. a young woman alone on winter roads, with Kettering's riders already circling in the night, and she stopped him with a look. If she stayed, she said, and waited safe in her house, while other people rode and testified and risked themselves for her name, then she would win the land and lose the only thing that made it worth winning, which was the right to say she had not run when running was offered. Corwin looked at her a long moment, this girl who had gone into a storm again and again for strangers, and he did not argue further. He would stay, he told her, and see the old man to the hearing, and stand watch in her yard so that Kettering's riders would find a man in the house if they came sniffing. Go, he told her. Go fast, and come back with the paper, and let this valley see what an Ashcroft is made of. She left before dawn the next morning on Tom Settler's mare, which the boy had pressed on her the moment he heard, refusing any argument, saying only that his father had known hers, and that a Sattler did not stand by while an Ashcroft rode alone. She carried her grandmother's letter in an oilcloth against her chest, the one written to her by name, because it steadied her to have it there. She carried a little of Hetty's coffee, and a sack of cornbread, and the empty revolver, because an empty gun that looked full might turn a coward where a loaded one might not be needed at all. She carried Price's written instruction, brought by Corwin, telling the territorial archivist exactly what to look for and under what filing. Most of all, she carried the knowledge that every hour mattered now, that the hearing would open in 2 days, whether she stood in the room or not, and that a paper found too late was worth no more than a paper never found. The road ran east and then north, up out of the valley through country the storm had scoured and abandoned. And for the first day she pushed the mare as hard as the ground allowed, walking her through the worst of the drifts, trotting her over the wind-cleared flats, stopping only long enough to rest and water her at a homestead where a hard-faced woman took one look at Della's face and asked no questions before offering the barn and a bait of oats. Della slept 3 hours in the straw with the mare's warmth beside her and was back on the road before the moon had set, because 2 days was not enough time, and she knew it. Because somewhere behind her a lawyer was arriving to stand nearly empty-handed before a commissioner unless she could put the killing proof into his hands in time. It was on the second day that she learned Kettering had not left even this road unwatched. She had stopped at a crossroads trading post to ask the way and to rest the mare, and the man behind the counter, after she described the archive she was bound for, grew careful and quiet in a way she had learned to read. A rider had come through the day before, he told her, not meeting her eyes, asking whether a young woman on a bay mare had passed that way, saying the girl was simple-minded and had wandered off from people who were worried sick, and that there was money for whoever sent word which way she went. Della felt the cold settle into her again, deeper this time, because she understood the cleverness of it. Kettering could not be seen to threaten her openly on a public road, so he had turned her into a runaway, a poor, addled girl to be gently detained and returned to the family that loved her, and any honest person who believed the tale would hand her over, thinking they did a kindness. She did not run from the post. She sat down calm at the man's rough table and asked him for coffee, and while he poured it, she laid her grandmother's letter on the wood and let him read the hand no forger could match. And she told him plainly who she was and what she rode for, the land and the lie, and the old man who had nearly burned for remembering the truth. The man read, and his careful face changed as he read, the way faces had been changing all week when honest eyes fell on that hand. He had a daughter about her age, he told her when he had finished, and he would sooner cut off his own arm than send a girl carrying that letter back to a man who would call her simple to get his hands on her. He told her a track that left the main road and rejoined it past the next settlement, rougher going but unwatched, and he filled her sack with what food he had, and he would take no coin for any of it. Kindness, Della thought as she rode out, was the one thing money could not counterfeit, and Kettering, for all his reach, had never learned to buy it. The unwatched track cost her time she could not spare, winding up through timbered hills where the snow lay deep and untracked, but it kept her clear of whoever waited on the main road. and she came down out of the hills in the failing light of the second day, with the archive town spread out ahead of her, a scatter of buildings dark against the last of the sun, and the record she needed somewhere among them. She found the building by asking a lamplighter, a squat stone structure with a single window still lit, and she hammered on the door past the hour when any office should have been open, past caring whether it was proper, because the hearing would open at noon the next day 50 miles behind her, and she had perhaps a night and a hard morning to find the record and carry it home, which was not enough, which had never been enough, but which was all the time there was. The archivist who opened the door was an old man himself, stooped and ink-stained and irritable at being disturbed. But he was no valley man. He owed the Ketterings nothing. And when Della thrust Price's written instruction into his hands and told him breathlessly what she sought, he read it twice, peering over his spectacles, and then he stood aside to let her in out of the cold. He remembered the Ashcroft matter, he told her, or rather, he remembered there had been talk of it years back, an old dispute out of the western valleys, and if the original filing from 1844 still existed, it would be down in the deep stacks where the territory kept its founding records. And he would look, but she should not set her hopes too high, because papers that old had a way of being mislaid or lost, or, he said, lowering his voice, of quietly disappearing when someone with money did not wish them found. He led her down into a cold stone room-lined floor, to ceiling with boxes and bound ledgers, and by the light of a single lamp he searched, muttering filing numbers under his breath, pulling boxes and pushing them back, while Della stood helpless in the doorway, with her heart hammering out the minutes she did not have. An hour passed, then another. The old man's mutter grew fretful, then troubled, and at last he stopped before a gap in a shelf where a box should have stood and did not, and he ran his finger along the dust to show her the clean rectangle where something had recently been removed. The box she needed had been here, he told her, his voice gone grim. It had been here, and it was here no longer, and boxes did not walk off on their own legs. Someone had come before her. Della felt the floor tilt under her the whole long ride, collapsing into nothing, 50 hard miles for an empty shelf. And for one terrible moment, she believed Kettering had beaten her even here, had reached ahead of her and pulled the killing paper out of the world before she could ever lay hands on it. Then the old archivist did a thing she had not expected. He straightened, and his ink-stained face set into stubborn lines, and he told her that a box removed from his archive without his leave was a theft from the territory itself, and that he kept a second record, an index of every filing that had ever passed through these stacks, precisely because he had learned in 50 years that original papers went missing and that a keen memory and a well-kept ledger were the only defense against it. If the bill of sale had been filed in 1844, then it was recorded in his index in the hand of whatever clerk had received it, with a summary of its contents and the names attached. And that record could not be stolen because it lived in a bound volume he had never once let out of the building. He climbed a ladder to a high shelf, his old joints protesting, and brought down a great leather ledger furred with dust, and he laid it on the table under the lamp and turned the brittle pages back through the decades until he reached the year, and he ran his finger down the columns while Della held her breath. There, his finger stopped. The entry was brief, a few lines in a long-dead clerk's careful hand, but it was everything. A bill of sale, filed in the autumn of 1844, purporting to transfer the water rights and grazing land at the head of the Western Valley from one Silas Thorne to Josiah Kettering, and beside it, in a different ink, added later, a notation that had made the receiving clerk uneasy enough to record his own doubt for the ages. A note that the seller Thorne had been declared an outlaw and fugitive within the very month the sale was filed, and that no witness to the signing could be produced when the territorial court inquired. The index did not merely record the sale. It recorded the clerk's own suspicion that it had been a forgery, set down in the founding books of the territory 40 years before Della was born to read it. The old archivist made her a certified copy in his own hand. slow and exact, stamping it with the territorial seal and signing his name and title beneath, because a copy from the official index, he told her, carried the weight of the original before any court in the territory, and no missing box could undo what the bound index plainly said. It was near midnight when he finished, and the ink was still wet when Della folded it into the oilcloth against her chest beside her grandmother's letter. Two papers now, where there had been 140 years apart in the writing, but joined at last in the same cause. She thanked the old man with tears standing in her eyes, and he waved them off gruffly, telling her he had spent his life keeping records against exactly the kind of man who thought money could rewrite what had happened, and that it did his old heart good, once before he died, to see the records win. She rode out before the moon had set, into the coldest dark of the night, with 50 miles of bad road between her and a hearing that would open at noon, and she knew as she put the mare to the road that it would be the near-run thing of her life, that 50 miles of winter road could not be crossed at an easy pace and still beat the sun to its height, that she would come into Harrow's Bend late whatever she did. Perhaps after the commissioner had opened the proceedings, perhaps after he had begun to lean. But late was not the same as never, and a paper that arrived in the last moment before a decision went final was a paper that arrived in time. And so she rode, through the black hours and the biting cold, told to the mare under her breath to keep them both moving, promising the animal rest and oats and a warm stall if it would only carry her home before the wrong words were spoken over her family's name. The dawn found her still far out, the mare tiring under her own body gone numb past feeling, and she climbed on down and walked to spare the animal, leading it through the drifts on legs that barely answered her, because a foundered horse would cost her more time than walking would, and she could not afford to lose the mare now, with the paper so close to home. She walked and walked again through the morning, watching the sun climb toward noon with a dread that grew with every degree it rose, until at last, cresting the final ridge above the valley, with the sun standing near its height, she saw Harrow's Bend spread out below her, and the little courthouse at the center of it, with wagons and horses crowded thick around, the whole town gathered to see the Ashcroft matter settled. And she knew the hearing had already begun. She put the tired mare down the last slope at a stumbling run, past the churchyard where her grandmother lay, past the mercantile with its shutters flung open, straight down the middle of the frozen street, to the courthouse steps, and she half fell from the saddle into the arms of Tom Sattler, who had been watching the ridge for her since first light and had refused to give her up. Inside, he told her, the words tumbling over each other, it was going badly. Kettering's man had produced the county records, showing the land had been Kettering ground for 40 years, and the commissioner had seemed ready to believe them. And Price had been fighting a losing action with the letters and the old man's testimony, but the county's own books stood against them. And it had begun to look, Tom said, his young face stricken, as though the truth was going to lose in the last room after all. Della pushed through the crowded doorway with the oilcloth clutched to her chest, her clothes stiff with frozen mud, her hair wild from 50 miles of wind, and the whole room turned to look at the apparition that had come through the door. At the front of it, behind a plain table, sat Commissioner, a spare, gray man with a tired, judicious face, and before him stood Nathaniel Price with a sheaf of her grandmother's letters in his hand, and defeat beginning to gather at the corners of his mouth. Across from him stood Amos Kettering, composed and prosperous in his good coat, and beside Kettering stood the records clerk, with a ledger open on the table, the county's own book that had been locked away, and now stood ready to swear. The land had never been an Ashcroft's at all. Every face in that room she knew, Hetty and the Smith, and Hollis Dean and Corwin Bell standing protective near the front, and in a chair set close to the commissioner's table, sat Elias Ward, frail and gray but upright, who had already given his testimony and been met. She could see it in the room, with the doubt a rich man's records could always buy against an old man's memory. The commissioner frowned at the interruption, at the mud-caked girl swaying in his doorway and asked who she was to come bursting into his proceedings. And Della crossed the room to Price on legs that would barely hold her and put the oilcloth into his hands before she answered. She was Della Ashcroft, she told the room. Her voice cracked with cold, but carrying to every corner of it. And she had ridden 2 days and 100 miles there and back to bring the one thing this room had been missing. And she asked the commissioner for 1 minute of his time before he ruled, because in that oilcloth was a certified copy from the founding records of the territory, records the Kettering family had never been able to reach. And those records would tell him plainly which of the papers on that table were true and which were forged. Price unfolded the copy with hands that had gone suddenly steady, and he read it. And Della watched the defeat drain out of his face, and something fierce and bright come into it, and he laid the certified copy before the commissioner and asked him to read the notation the receiving clerk had set down in 1844. The clerk's own recorded doubt that the bill of sale was genuine, the note that no witness to the signing could be produced. The commissioner read it once in silence, then a second time, and the tired judicious face grew still, and he lifted his eyes from the paper to look at Amos Kettering with an expression that had not been in the room a moment before. The records clerk had gone the color of old ash. Kettering, to his credit as an actor, held his composure and told the commissioner smoothly that a copy of an index proved nothing, that the girl could have had it forged like everything else she carried, that this was a desperate performance meant to cloud a clear matter. But the commissioner was no longer looking at him as a man looks at a respected neighbor. He was looking at him the way a man looks at a card player whose sleeve has just come open. A certified copy under the territorial seal, he said slowly, was not a thing produced by a simple-minded girl in Sing Single Night on the road. And he found it curious, he added, his voice sharpening, that the county's own records had been locked away from public view in the very week before this hearing, when by law they should have stood open for any party to examine. He turned to the ash-colored clerk and asked him, quite quietly, whether the county's book had been altered. The clerk broke. He was a weak man who had bent to power all his life because bending was easier than breaking. And now the two men he feared stood on opposite sides of the room, and he could no longer serve them both. It came out of him in a rush, the way a thing long held under pressure comes out once the seal is cracked. That yes, the book had been changed, that Amos Kettering had come to him and had him alter the record of the original filing, that his own father had done the same for Josiah Kettering 40 years gone, that the Vance family had kept the Kettering lie alive in the county books for 2 generations because they had been made to understand their livelihood depended on it. He was weeping as he said it, an old fear finally breaking, telling the commissioner he had never wanted any part of it, that he had only done what he was told, that a small man in a small county did what the big man required, or he did not eat. The room had gone from murmur to a silence. So complete Della could hear the clerk's ragged breathing and the settle of a log in the stove. Elias Ward rose then from his chair, slow and trembling, leaning hard on his cane, and the commissioner, seeing an old man on his feet, did not stop him. Ward looked across the crowded room at Amos Kettering, and he said, in a voice ruined by smoke but steady as the iron pin driven into the frozen ground of the valley, that he had watched Josiah Kettering steal that land with a forged paper in the autumn of 1844, that he had been young and afraid and had kept his silence for 40 years, and that a man could carry a stone that long only by telling himself he would set it down when it was safe. But it was never safe, he told them. It was only ever later. He had come to understand at the end of his life that a truth left unspoken long enough curdled into a lie of its own, and he had let a good man be called an outlaw for 40 years, and he would not carry that into the ground. If standing here in this cold room cost him what little time he had left, then it was the best use he had ever put his time to. Something broke open in the room at the old man's words, some long-held agreement the whole town had lived inside without ever naming it, the quiet consensus that the Ketterings were simply the shape the world took in that valley and always would be. Faces that had been careful and closed all week came open. Hollis Dean stood up from his place along the wall and told the commissioner he had heard the tale of Silas Thorne the outlaw his whole life, that his own father had told it to frighten him as a boy, and that he would be ashamed to his last day to know he had believed a lie built to rob a neighbor. One by one, others rose, not to swear to facts they did not know, but to say plainly that they had seen Margaret Ashcroft's hand and could not be told it was forged, that they had known the girl's father as an honest hard-luck man who had died still chasing water stolen from his own family before he was born, that whatever the county's book had been made to say, they knew the difference between a truth and a purchase. Amos Kettering stood alone at his table while the room turned against him, and Della watched the composure he had worn like armor for a lifetime begin to crack apart, watched him understand in real time that the thing his family had held for 40 years by money and fear was coming down around him in a single hour, undone by a dead woman's letters, an old man's confession, and a girl who had ridden through winter to lay the founding truth of the territory on the table before him. He made one last attempt, his voice rising for the first time, no longer smooth, telling the commissioner this was mob feeling and not law, that a man's property could not be stripped from him on the word of an old servant's grudge and a clever girl's theater. But the commissioner had heard enough. He gathered the papers before him, the certified copy and the letters, and the county book the clerk had just confessed to altering. And he looked at Amos Kettering a long, steady moment before he spoke. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would remake the valley. He would not rule finally from the bench in a single sitting on a matter of this weight, he said. For there were charges here of forgery and of the alteration of public records that would have to go before a proper court, and the clerk's confession alone would see to that. But on the narrow question before him, the ownership of the land at the head of the valley, he had seen and heard enough to be certain of one thing. The Kettering claim rested entirely upon a bill of sale, the territory's own founding index, recorded as doubtful from the day it was filed. A bill of sale whose original had gone conveniently missing from a locked archive, and against it stood the letters of Margaret Ashcroft in a hand a dozen honest people in that room had sworn they knew, the sworn memory of a witness to the original theft, and the freely given confession of the very clerk who had helped to falsify the record. On the weight of all that, he found no honest basis for the Kettering claim, and he found the land at the head of the Western Valley had been, and remained, the lawful property of the Ashcroft family, held these 40 years exactly as Margaret Ashcroft's papers said it was held, and that it passed now, whole and unclouded, to her granddaughter Della. The room did not cheer. It was too solemn a thing for cheering, the unmaking of 40 years of accepted history in a single cold morning. And instead a long exhale moved through the crowd, the sound of a town setting down a lie it had carried. So long it had forgotten, the lie was heavy. Della stood swaying at the front of the room with the exhaustion of the ride finally crashing over her, now that there was nothing left to hold it back. And Nathaniel Price put a steadying hand under her elbow, and across the room Elias Ward lowered himself back into his chair, with the spent, peaceful look of a man who has finally set down a stone he had carried so long it had shaped his spine to its weight. Amos Kettering gathered his hat from the table with hands that were not quite steady, and he walked out through the crowd that parted before him, not in respect now, but in the way people step back from a thing that has begun to rot, and he did not look at Della as he passed, though she looked at him, and what she felt watching him go was not triumph but tolerance right. The plain settling of a names, the reckoning came for Amos Kettering in the weeks that followed, not by her hand but by the laws. For a proper court took up the charges the commissioner had passed along, and the clerk's confession and the altered books and the fire in an old man's room made a case Kettering's money could no longer smother. He was not a young man, and the fight had gone out of him the day the town turned in that cold room. And in the end he sold off what he could, and left the valley he had ruled for a lifetime rather than stand in the dock before the neighbors who had finally seen him whole. Della took no pleasure in the going. Her grandmother had not written "keep it" so that another family might be broken. She had written it so that a lie would not be the last word, and the lie was answered now, and that was enough. She paid the note on the house in full and took the paper back and fed it into the stove. And she stood and watched the debt that had ridden her family for a generation curl into flame and go up the pipe as smoke. And the house on Wren Lane was wholly hers at last, every board and joint of it, kept and paid and free. She rode out to the head of the valley in the first true thaw, with the deed folded in her coat, and she walked the land that was hers now by law and by blood and by 40 years of a dead woman's faith. And she began, quietly, to make plans for a life to be lived on it. Spring came slow, and then all at once, the way it does in high country, the snow drawing back off the south slopes to leave the grass rising green, and the creek running full and bright over its clean stones. Della had 2 men from town raise a small cabin by the water, rough and new and smelling of cut pine, with a lean-to for a horse she meant to buy come summer, and a shed for the maul she had mended and would use again. She moved the crate's contents to the cabin herself, one careful load at a time, and set them where they belonged. On the mantel above the new hearth she placed 3 things and no more. The family Bible, with the letters folded safe inside its cover. The tintype of the young man in the dark coat, her great-uncle, with her father's eyes and her own. And the small revolver, still empty, still wrapped in its cloth, with the note her grandmother had pinned to it. His, do not sell. She did not need the gun for anything but remembering, and remembering, she had come to understand, was the whole of what her grandmother had asked of her. In the churchyard, she set a small flat stone at the foot of Margaret Ashcroft's grave with a single letter cut into it, the letter M. And she did not explain it to anyone who asked, because some things did not want explaining. They wanted only to be true and known by the one who needed to know them. She walked past Elias Ward's bench outside the smithy on a warm afternoon near the end of that spring, and she stopped before him with her hands folded in front of her, and she told him she understood him now, all of it. And the old man looked up at her with his pale washed eyes and, for the first time in her memory, let a smile move plain across his face. Good, he told her. That was all. He did not need to say more, and she did not need to hear it, and she went on down the road lighter than she had come. The Bell family came up the track to the cabin on a long gold evening in the last week of spring. Corwin, and Ada and June, who was walking sure on her feet now, and ran the last stretch of the path to throw her arms around Della's knees. They brought a jar of Ada's preserves, and, on a length of soft rope, a young hound pup that sat down in the new grass and would come no further until Della knelt and let it smell her hand, and then it pressed its head against her wrist and did not pull away. They had wanted her to have him, Ada told her, for the company through the nights. Adela knelt in the grass with the pup, leaning warm against her, and thought that she had reached into a storm one winter night for a stranger's family, and had drawn back out of it in the fullness of time everything a person could need: a friend, a witness, a lawyer, a town, and now this small breathing warmth that had chosen her. The light went long and honeyed across the valley, the way it had that first evening she opened the crate. Only now there was no dread in it. Only the clean gold pouring down the ridge and holding there a while before it let go. Corwin turned his hat in his hands and asked her what she meant to call the place. And Della stood with the pup's rope loose in her fingers and looked out across the rising grass to the creek and up the ridge to where the last of the sun was letting go. And she gave him the answer she had ridden 100 miles in 40 years of family silence to be able to give. She had not come home to inherit a dead man's trouble, she told him. She had come home to keep what he had been holding for them all along, and to live on it in the open, in the daylight, with her own name and his set right at last over the same clear water. The man took off his hat. The woman rested her hand on her child's bright head. The pup leaned against Della's boot, and the light went slow and clean off the ridge and into the wide spring sky. And the valley held its long quiet the way it had held it for 40 years. No longer waiting now, but kept, the way the truest things are always kept, by someone who had finally come home to stay.